Durham, who was a leading light. Everybody turned to him, to Bernard Durham, to watch the news when he was the anchor. But now, whatever channel you're watching, you can have access just by clicking with your mouse. So you don't have to sit down at home at a specific time, at a specific hour, to watch the news anchored by Bernard Durham, which we did for years with great pleasure. And he was a very reputable anchor. But the same thing goes for newspapers. Why would people pay for a paper copy of a newspaper when you can consult all those articles on an internet site? So that's what I was getting at. You don't have to buy a newspaper, a paper copy. So I didn't remember the last time I'd purchased a newspaper, like a physical copy of a newspaper. People misinterpreted that. The fact is, I get my news online because things have changed. And there's Le Soleil, which is over 100 years old from my area. And so I know I'm kind of comparing my role as a journalist with that of a politician. But what I'm getting at is when you go on Le Soleil's website, if you try to read too many free articles, then all of a sudden there's a paywall. They want you to subscribe. So that's how the print media have adapted. I think other newspapers are doing the same thing. The Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, a number of newspapers have implemented these paywalls. So they've self-regulated, they've been self-disciplined, and that's a way for them to get some revenues. And that's why we think that we think it's important to strike the right financial balance with this legislation. And that's where the whole question of the major players enters into the debate. Netflix, all the major players. These are companies that can produce and present and offer stories, and they won't. They can post stories, but the money doesn't necessarily make its way all the way to the author of the story. So we need to find ways to ensure that the producer gets their fair cut, but they should also have to invest so that more content is created. So ultimately, it's the reader, the listener listening to a documentary or podcast or whatever on internet. So the user has to pay their fair share too. So, Madam Speaker, in our opinion, this bill does not do an adequate job of answering those questions. And as my colleague from Calgary, Nose Hill, mentioned, I just remembered her riding name. So we think we need to go back to the drawing board. The government needs to take this bill, or the committee needs to take this bill back to the drawing board. We need to strike the right balances between traditional and new media. We need to make sure that creators can function in the current environment. We saw that in the pandemic, people were largely holed up at home, and that was a challenge for artists and creators. And some people were very creative, to say the least, during that period. So, Madam Speaker, we mustn't look at new media or new internet approaches as something that we need to take a dim view of. No, on the contrary, we should seize the opportunity. With every problem, there are new opportunities that present themselves, and it's our role as lawmakers to set out the appropriate limits, the appropriate guidelines, the appropriate rules so that users pay their fair share and artists and creators can continue to inform us adequately and entertain us as well. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable.
The honourable member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles.
Madame.
Yes, Rivière-des-Mille-Îles, Madame. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for Louis Saint-Laurent, who I hold in high regard. As you all know, the Bloc Québécois will be supporting this bill with pleasure. The changes we proposed to C10 are now reflected in C12, or C11 rather. I'd like my colleague to tell us, with all his experience as a journalist and an excellent one at that, how does what is the problem with C11 in his opinion?
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci aux collègues de Mille. Évidemment, sans encore
I'd like to
saisissons l'occasion, député de Mille-Île et le fils de.
I'd like to thank the member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles for his question. And thousands of Quebecers and Canadians have seen that great things can be done without writing, but rather with a camera. You can capture the feeling of a moment and so my colleague's father, I believe, was a great photographer in Roxham, if I'm not mistaken. Madam Speaker, we have to take a more holistic view, a more global view. And as a journalist, I think we need to find a balance between healthy competition and productive competition between the various media, while at the same time ensuring that those who need access to information can get that access within a framework that allows competition to occur, but also that allows the media to thrive. And I mentioned Le Soleil, Le Devoir, and other newspapers, and they now have a paywall. And that's fine. Some people are a bit more, those who are pinch pennies, they want that for free, but nothing's free, Madam Speaker.
Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And the honourable member talks about striking the right balance, and that's what this bill does. It's about balancing interest. There's companies like TVA or Quebecor that have obligations under the Broadcast Act to produce content for Quebec culture and broader companies for Canadian culture. Why doesn't he expect that an American company like Google or a major Chinese company like TikTok have those same obligations? It's patently unfair, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint-Laurent.
Thank my colleague for this very important question. Well, we have a different perspective on that, Madam Speaker. For sure, we all agree, all of us agree in this House, whatever the party that we represent, that we need to have the share representation. And if you want to have access on something, nothing falls from the sky. We have to pay for that. Yeah. And the money should be get back where it belongs. So if we want to have new products and good wages for that, we need to have a fair tariff. The colleague talked about Quebecor and TVA, and yes, they have the obligation to produce here. What we are asking is just to be sure that those who produce great quality documentary or something else have access to the same platform that the TVA or some others could have. So for us, we have some concern with how the bill is written right now. So this is why we are putting back to a parliamentary committee.
We have time for a brief question.
The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to ask about tax equity. For years, broadcasters and cable distributors would invest in Quebec and Canadian content. With the new players, digital broadcasters, they got a free pass for years. My question is simple. Why should Videotron pay, but not Google or YouTube? The Honourable Member, a quick answer. That's a very good question, Madam Speaker, and that is the reason for which we believe that this bill isn't good enough when it comes to a balance we need to strike and a fair share that must be dispersed from all content distributors without hindering the quality of content and the initiatives that creators should have on YouTube, for example.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
C'est bien. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you for the warm reception always in the House here, particularly from across the aisle. It's always an honor, Madam Speaker, to talk in the House, but particularly on an issue such as the importance of C10 or C11. My apologies. I'm in the last Parliament there, guys. So. No. Bill C11.
There is no going back and forth. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary should know that. The Honourable Member can continue on.
So, Speaker, you know what? The broadcasting and the communications industry has changed dramatically. COVID-19 has shown us that it's incredibly important in today's day and age to have access to unfettered news, unfettered communication, as many of us were locked down in our houses for months at a time. And in many cases, our sole form of communication was through the internet, and that's the way we communicated with the outside world. And the great news is that Canada is no longer restricted to a few channels. I can remember when I was younger that we would have 3 or 4 or 5 channels, and that would be it. That'd be the maximum channel. And that I lived out in rural Ontario, rural Canada, and so we used to have to move the antenna to get CBC, and that was our one communication and around there. Now we have Twitter, we have Facebook, TikTok, Reddit, among many other platforms. And I'll actually discuss one great communicator. He's from my riding. He actually lives about 5 minutes from my house, Mr. Wyatt Sharp. Wyatt is a young man, I believe about 13 years of age, who is one of the leading voices, if you can imagine that, at 13 years of age, one of the leading voices in Canadian politics today, leading the discourse on many important issues at 13 years of age. And how did he do it? Well, he started actually working at the Orono Times, writing a paper, and then he just moved on to social media. If it wasn't for the great and access to social media, Wyatt's voice would have been limited to the wonderful community, but the relatively small community of Orono. As it is now, he goes from coast to coast to coast to coast. And if you haven't been on the Wyatt Sharp Show, or you haven't listened to his podcast, I highly recommend it. When we look at social media, this bill casts it as another CBC, another NBC, another broadcasting network. I don't think that's accurate, Madam Speaker, with respect. I believe it's closer, the internet is closer to the public square, where we go out as Canadians and we share our views, our visions, and they might be miles apart. But it's so critical that we have those discourses. It's so critical that we go out on the battlefield of ideas and we discuss them. And some of those ideas will fall by the wayside in favor of better ones. Yet other ones will be improved and get better. And so having that unfettered access to that public square that we call the internet is so incredibly important. Canadians have always felt the ability to communicate completely unfettered and have that ability to share their ideas, share those visions. And quite frankly, that's what alarms me about this legislation, is the fact that we're moving away from freedom of speech and starting to restrict it. And I dare say it perhaps going a little bit too far, but we really don't have to look too far in history or even around the world to look examples of what happens when the government goes too far in restricting freedom of speech. We can go back in time and we can look at the Soviet Union as they pushed out their propaganda and they told lies to their people, which held people behind for years and years, sitting in breadlines, meanwhile being fed that they were actually ahead of the Western world, which we all knew was false. We see that the modern-day incarnation of that in Vladimir Putin restricting freedom of speech, restricting the internet as Russians are unable to hear about or listen to the atrocities that are happening in the Ukraine. It is freedom of speech that is a pillar of Western democracy, that is a pillar. It really supports many of the other democracy, of the other freedoms and rights that we all share. It is based on that. It is a foundational to our country and to many around the world. And so when we mess with that foundation, we must do so with the greatest of care, and we must use a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. There are some out there who say, yes, but there are certainly this is going on. Content is being curated right now by large multinational, multi-billion-dollar corporations. So why is the government not in a better position? The challenge is that there's no one watching the government. When we look at companies that have stepped offside, the government should, and they have a rightful obligation to ask for greater accountability and transparency when it comes to sorting and curating and the appropriate algorithms. We must do that carefully, and as legislator, that's our role, is to be oversight. But when we have the government watching the government, we have the fox watching the henhouse, and that should be troublesome for all Canadians. And the reality is, when we look at the internet right now, certainly there are challenges, as I said. Greater transparency with respect to algorithms and otherwise are critically important. But there has been a tremendous growth in Canadian content. The Canadian Media Producers Association suggested that the industry has actually grown by a record amount, that there have been a record investments in film and television, totally almost doubling in the last decade. I am inspired by what's going on in my own riding of Northumberland, Peterborough South. Albert Botha, Heather Helden, and the Southeastern Ontario Production Accelerator Fund. This initiative is making Southeastern Ontario the next hotspot for a bustling film and TV industry, and I'm very proud of what they're accomplishing. On that note, that certified Canadian content has actually grown in recent years to the highest growth for certified Canadian content television has occurred over the past 3 years. My fear is that when we go to change this very foundation, the freedom of speech, this freedom of expression, we could do more harm than good, not only by restricting people's ability to express themselves, but about the production of Canadian content itself. While there's no doubt that traditional broadcasters may benefit from the restriction of this content and bringing others into this content, it will almost certainly inhibit the amount of content that is produced as we start to regulate user-controlled content. The other hallmark of poor legislation is a lack of clarity. And quite frankly, this legislation is replete with a lack of clarity. The Honourable Minister claims that the legislation features guardrails against overly broad regulation to keep the nature of the internet as it is, but there's no specific eligibility. In fact, many of the decisions are actually pushed on to the bureaucracy. And as much as I respect, and I think our public service often does a great job out there, they are not ultimately accountable to the people like parliamentarians are. And so when we push our work, our decisions onto the bureaucracy, we lose accountability as a government. Bill C11 includes many terms that it simply just does not define. User-generated content is not defined. Social media is not defined. Yet these words are used repeatedly. Just a time check there. That's fantastic. That's great. An hour will take it. One of the troubling, and I'll get to one of the troubling sections is the user-generated content. It's excluded and then brought back in, and that's troublesome. So we have user-generated content that people are creating from all around Canada. And instead of treating these folks as I think it should be properly viewed, as the public square, as the sharing of discourse, as the battlefield of ideas, allowing all entrants onto the field, it restricts them. It starts to treat individuals who are out there as they would the CBC and other major broadcasting them, making them pay fees, making them subject to content restrictions and algorithm restrictions. I believe that Canada is best when we let Canadians decide, and unfortunately, this legislation puts the government in the driver's seat, allowing them to make decisions that Canadians should be allowed to make.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, first off, I just want to say that this member is incredibly lucky to have Wyatt Sharp in his riding. What an incredible young individual who by no means anybody should judge his ability to interview anybody based on his age, because I know when I appeared on his his show not that long ago. He is a hard-hitting individual who knows his stuff well in advance. But my real concern over the member's speech, Madam Speaker, is his comments with respect to how this bill is somehow going to limit user content. And I can't help but think that something that we chuckled at the beginning of his speech when he talked about C10 might actually be true, because what this bill has in it that perhaps C10 was not as explicit about is a number of sections that reference making sure that user-generated content is protected. Sections 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, Section 3A, 4.1, 4.2, and 4.3 subsection 3. I'm wondering if the member has actually read this version of the bill, or if indeed his comments about user-generated content were based on Bill C10.
Good question.
The honourable member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Thank you. And as always, I admire the passion, not necessarily the substance of that member's response. If you go to section 4.1 sub 2, it creates an exception to an exception where user-generated content where they make some type of profit or dollars from it, it is absolutely brought in. That is clear. That's the end of the answer, and it's the right answer.
The honourable member for Bay James, Nunavik EU. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his presentation. It's a fundamental aspect of our society. We know that Quebec and Canadian culture has waited for this bill for decades. The first request from the cultural sector was adopt the bill as rapidly as possible. That's what they asked. We've already waited long enough, they said. So what does the honourable member have to say? How can we make this bill come to be as rapidly as possible, and why do you not want it to be adopted?
Mais je vais demander au député, l'honorable député de Northumberland, Peter.
I would like to ask the honourable member to respond. Thank you for that question.
The response is that, unfortunately, this legislation is failed, and of course, I share her passion for Canadian and the Quebec culture, and would like to see nothing more than it to be promoted. However, this bill is replete with challenges and difficulties, including a lack of definition and clarity, including a lack of definition of what Canadian content is, including the regulation of user-generated content, which is just it's very challenging.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Windsor West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. One of the issues that we're faced with here, if you do take the conservative line with it in terms of the government, I guess, being more controlling on this issue, the reality is that we are elected by the citizens of our country to make decisions and set regulations, and some of the things he's raised can be fixed in the bill. Now, we're looking for amendments for that. But if we don't, then we leave it to U.S. web giants to have complete control over Canadian artists and their fate. So what suggestion would we go forward with if we don't put this bill into committee and fix it and some other issues and turn over all this Canadian content and artists to the control of web giants in the United States and other parts of the world?
The honourable member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Thank you very much, and I thank the member for his excellent question. And there's no doubt that there needs to be work. The Broadcasting Act needs to be amended and to change. I mean, I certainly don't use my Sony Walkman anymore, and so on that note, we need to update it. The problem is that this bill is so bad that we need to go back to the drawing board. Unfortunately, it has all the hallmarks of bad legislation, a lack of clarity. It's overly it's overly burdensome to the industry. It also creates too much onus on the bureaucracy and not enough on parliamentarians.
Alors, conformément à l'article 38 du règlement.
It is my duty pursuant to Standing Order 38 to inform the House that the questions to be raised tonight at the time of adjournment are as follows.
Member for Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke, Health, and the honourable member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston, Labour. Resuming debate. Reprise de débat. The honourable member for Edmonton Riverbend.
Is that how this works, Madam Speaker? All right.
He's new here. Sorry.
Madam Speaker, I'm happy to rise in the House and speak to Bill C11, an almost carbon copy of Bill C10, which the Minister of Heritage himself, to his credit, admitted was deeply flawed. Let me start by first acknowledging the creators, the artists, the musicians, and all those who work so hard to bring Canada's arts and culture to the world. They undoubtedly deserve to be highlighted and given the opportunity to share our history and stories on many platforms available in today's world. I know that myself and many of my colleagues have experienced firsthand and met with many talented individuals across our country. The Conservative Party knows the importance of ensuring that Canadian artists are heard, appreciated, and given the ability to share their art with not just Canadians, but with the world. Creators need rules which don't hold back their ability to be Canadian and global successes. There is absolutely no doubt that after 30 years, the Broadcasting Act should be updated. Technology has evolved, and the ways in which Canadians create and consume stories has changed. 30 years ago, the internet wasn't what it is today, and people relied on radio, cable television, and newspapers to consume content. That is what the Broadcasting Act was designated to regulate. Today, most Canadians consume content on the internet, from streaming services to social media platforms. We live in a world where digital information is accessible to everyone in this country at any time. I'll first take the opportunity to highlight what Bill C11 is proposing. First, the bill proposes to expand the Broadcasting Act beyond the current platforms that include large foreign and domestic streaming services such as Netflix, Prime, and Disney+. It also includes user-generated content created on social media sites such as YouTube and TikTok. This means newer forms of media previously subjected to little or no government oversight will be brought under the authority of the Canadian Radio Television Telecommunications Commission, CRTC. I, as well as many Canadians, know Bill C10 contains similar content and raised concerns from not only opposition members regarding free speech, but many organizations. The inclusion of user-generated content in Bill C10 meant anything any Canadians chose to upload or post on social media or any creative content sharing platform would fall under the authority of the Broadcasting Act, meant it would be regulated by the CRTC. Now, why was that an issue? There was very little accountability, and it was unclear what authority was being given to CRTC. There was no indication of what any of the regulations would be, and there would be little to no parliamentary oversight, meaning a government agency would be controlling what contents Canadians see. But now, back to this bill we're debating today. In Bill C11, the government has included an exclusion on user-generated content on social media. However, upon reading the bill, there seems to be an exclusion to this exclusion. And what does that mean, Madam Speaker? It means that once the government, through the CRTC, could regulate user-generated content. So Matt Hatfield from Open Media said the following: "Trying to exclude user-generated content from the CRTC regulations is a good step and acknowledgement by the government the last year's Bill C10 was a mistake. The problem is that it isn't clear if they've actually excluded user-generated content. They're working from a foundation of clean separation of professional and amateur content or on the internet that simply doesn't exist. Major Canadian internet productions like podcasts could find themselves in the worst of all worlds, subject to the CRTC regulation, while not able to seek CanCon funding," end quote. So while we can acknowledge an attempt by the government to fix their admitted error within Bill C10, there is still too much uncertainty about the impact of Bill C11 could have on digital-first creators. According to a 2019 report from researchers at Ryerson University, there is, and I quote, "an estimated 160,000 Canadian content creators on YouTube, including 40,000 who have enough of an audience to monetize their channels. These 40,000 creators have in turn sparked the development of nearly 28,000 full-time jobs. These are positive economic impacts that should be encouraged and praised rather than hindered and targeted. While the intent of the bill may be to support Canada's broadcasting industries, it marginalizes Canadian digital content creators who are successfully sharing Canadian stories across the globe. Mr. Speaker, we on this side of the House do believe that large foreign streaming services and social media platforms should not be given unfair advantages over the regulated Canadian broadcasting sector. They should be expected to contribute and create Canadian content and have Canadians tell Canadian stories. Foreign streamers should pay their fair share. Mr. Speaker, we all agree that large streaming providers should feature more Canadian content, but what is Canadian content? Recently, I watched the Disney film Turning Red with my kids. It's set in Toronto and tells a story of growing up as a Chinese-Canadian teenager. These films stars Canadian actors, yet under the current rules, this movie is not considered Canadian content. A series based entirely on the Toronto Maple Leafs, being streamed on Amazon, is not considered Canadian content. The Handmaid's Tale, based on a novel written by a Canadian author, filmed in Canadian cities, is not considered Canadian content. The movie Deadpool, based on a Canadian comic book character starring a Canadian actor, co-written by a Canadian and filmed in Vancouver, is not considered Canadian content. Madam Speaker, this bill requires the streaming services to invest and create more Canadian content. However, these films, biographies, and TV shows adaptations the most of us would consider Canadian content simply are not. This definition must be broadened so that these large streaming services want to invest in our great Canadian talent and tell Canadian stories. Madam Speaker, I want to turn more broadly to the CRTC, because I think a large part of the criticism of this bill is a lack of clarity with the amount of control and regulatory powers that will be given to the CRTC. It will be up to the CRTC to administer this act, and I think there's reason to be concerned. The CRTC is already spread thin and lacks the capacity to carry out the current mandate effectively. How exactly can Canadians have faith in the CRTC's ability to regulate the internet and redefine what is Canadian content when it's already struggling to cope with the 4,000 or 5,000 entities in the broadcasting sector? What tools will have to be provided to the CRTC? How much money will this cost taxpayers? My colleague, a member from Saskatoon Grasswood, asked the CRTC chairman, how is the CRTC ever going to pay for this? His response, it will go directly through the Treasury Board, meaning Canadians will be on the hook for more regulations and rules with no oversight or accountability. The government has proposed Bill C11 with the Just Trust Us approach and has failed to provide clear policy direction on how the CRTC's regulatory powers will be interpreted. It is unclear whether the CRTC even has the capacity or, to be frank, the competency to actually successfully execute what the government is proposing through Bill C11. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I agree with the honourable member when he started his speech. He talked about Canadian artists deserve to be shared on many platforms, and they need to be heard. And that's what this bill does, excluding user-generated content. But he talks about digital-first creators, and I hear this from the Conservatives, and I heard it in committee, and I'm hearing it in the House, how great they are, and we agree, they're doing great things. But in question period, the honourable member for Perth Wellington mocked them as influencers and was shocked that the government spent money on advertisement through digital-first creators. So do the Conservatives respect digital-first creators, or are they just a rhetorical pawn to try to stall Bill C11?
The honourable member for Edmonton Riverbend.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and it's always a pleasure to be in the chamber with my friend and colleague on the other side. However, I would point him back to what we're hearing from a lot of those within the creative sector. Darcy Michael, comedian and digital content creator, who came to his committee just a few weeks ago, he said, Bill C11 will directly affect my ability to earn an income. That aside, I'm also an ACTRA member, so I do want to say I'm on both sides of traditional and digital media. So on this side of the House, Madam Speaker, I started my speech by reaching out and sharing my opinions of those of us on those sides, the respect that we have for our creators in this country, and we just ask that at the end of the day that the government treats them fairly.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you to my honourable friend from Edmonton Riverbend. The issue of creators, and I know we had this debate around C10, when is a product Canadian, even if it's called Canadian something or other. I happen to have family that's in the film business, actors. a lot of what the U.S. productions that are filmed in Canada do is pay scale to Canadian actors, pay the big bucks, even if, I mean, we all love Ryan Reynolds, who doesn't, but he lives in the States and he gets the big bucks and he deserves them. But our actors who are in Deadpool and in other films that are filmed in Canada, if they're not getting paid at the same rates, if they're not getting their careers boosted, then we are undermining Canadian content by having a kind of Canadian gloss over a U.S. production, even if it's Handmaid's Tale. So that I just put that to him for comment.
Yeah, member for Edmonton Riverbend.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thanks to my friend from Saanich, Gulf Islands. So my full disclosure, my dad was a film producer. I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta, which didn't have a thriving film industry at the time. My dad struggled to make a go by doing side jobs, working with the government and local commercials. So at the end of the day, you know, I've seen the struggles that local creators, from whether it be actors to producers to filmmakers, go through, and it's to be Canadian. It's always been a challenge going against our neighbors to the south. So when it comes to movies like Deadpool, you know, I think it's a great opportunity for us to highlight that disparity that we sometimes see when it comes to our Canadian creators.
We have time for a brief question, une brève réponse. Question, l'honorable député de Abitibi.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Bay James Nunavik-EU. Thank you, Madam Speaker. C11 is essential. The report is clear. We need to make the web giants invest in our programming. It's not a matter of money, it's a matter of culture. So I'd like to know why this member objects to that.
Member for Edmonton Riverbend.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, there was an interesting article that was written by Andrew Coyne in the Globe and Mail, and what he indicated, he said this bill would assign wide latitude to regulate, well, the internet. Not only the big audio and visual streaming services like Spotify, Netflix, but any member of other services from podcasts, audiobooks, and news channels, and not only those based in Canada, but anywhere in the world. So for surely this should be a great concern for all of us across the country.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm proud to be speaking on behalf of the constituents from Saskatoon West. We are a diverse group of citizens from many backgrounds and variety of different views, and they've called me and emailed me over the past year asking about stopping online censorship. They want to be free from government overreach back then, and they feel the same way now. The people of Saskatoon West also want an end to the unscientific, job-killing NDP Liberal federal mandates. Many have voiced their concerns on social media platforms. They are concerned that the government is going to block their voices. And speaking of censorship, this government has quite a history of shutting down opposing voices, even when it comes to members of their own caucus. Remember, of course, Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott. In the last Parliament, the government introduced its first attempt at regulating the internet with its bills C10 and C36. These bills generated incredible feedback for me via telephone, written letters, emails, and on social media. And I think it's safe to say that the overall response was extremely negative. And many in the media, many consultants, and many ordinary folks were very concerned by this legislation. And I'd hoped that after seeing all of the opposition to those bills last time around, the government would smarten up and rethink this flawed legislation. Unfortunately, smartening up is not in the wheelhouse of this government, and instead they've doubled down and reintroduced essentially the same thing. Let's dive into C11. The minister stated that the goal of this bill is to target only big online streamers and exclude day-to-day users. It's supposedly about making Canadian content more accessible. The only problem with this argument is that Canadian content has always been accessible. Canadian producers have been able to jump onto various platforms like TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, and showcasing their content without a problem. So why the urge to regulate the internet now? The current government thinks that the content available for users isn't Canadian enough for their liking. This is where things start moving towards online censorship. Essentially, any content deemed unworthy by the NDP Liberals will be bumped out of your recommended feeds in exchange for government-approved content. Content that isn't Canadian enough for the CRTC regulators will be sent to the back of the internet. Which leads to a question: who reaps the benefits of this? You guessed it, the legacy media. In this new age, where we get most of our information online, broadcasting companies like the government's beloved taxpayer-funded CBC have been left in the dust. At the end of the day, they want their content promoted over everyone else's. They're the ones scrambling for advertising revenue. This will throw the remaining content, Canadian or not, to the side. Many experts have raised concerns about this bill being very similar to the NDP Liberal government's original Internet Censorship Bill C10, in the sense that it still has the power to block Canadian freedom of expression online. The former Vice Chair of the CRTC, Peter Menzies, stated, and I quote, "The biggest difference is that it's called Bill C11 instead of Bill C10," and added, "It's unfortunate because they're giving the CRTC enormous powers, and it's not in the DNA of any regulatory body to not continue to expand its turf," end quote. The major criticism of C10 surrounded the issue of user-generated content, those pictures, audios, and videos that many of us share on a daily basis on social media. There was a clause in C10 that exempted this from regulation, but it was removed at committee, creating a firestorm of concern. At the very least, I'd expected the government to address this issue. Instead, they added an exception to allow the CRTC to regulate user content. Michael Geist, the Canadian Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce at Law, stated, quote, "For all the talk that user-generated content is out, the truth is that everything from podcasts to TikTok videos fit neatly into the new exception that gives the CRTC the power to regulate such content as a program," end quote. In other words, user-generated content is not subject to regulation unless the CRTC decides it is subject to regulation, in which case it is subject to regulation. Confused yet? The truth is, the vague language in this bill opens the door for the government to abuse its power and regulate user-generated content. The internet is our main go-to for information, and many Canadians are earning a good living by making entertaining or educational content on various different platforms. The way this bill is currently written will limit this creativity and possibly censor a wide range of the content produced online. Twitter issued these scathing words, quote, "People around the world have been blocked from accessing Twitter and other services in a similar manner as the one proposed by Canada by multiple authoritarian governments like China, North Korea, and Iran, for example, under the false guise of online safety, impeding people's rights to access information online." They go on to say that C11 sacrifices freedom of expression to the creation of a government-run system of surveillance for anyone who uses Twitter, end quote. Think about that. Twitter is comparing this government to North Korea, and that was before Elon Musk bought it. The NDP Liberal government is doing what we've seen time and time again, dividing Canadians and stripping away our rights and freedoms one by one. And now the government is creating a three-headed dragon to take away freedom of expression online from Canadians. These three heads are this Internet Censorship Bill C11, the News Regulation Bill C18, and the expected return of Bill C36 that blocks online content that the government doesn't like. And if you don't think this government wants to shut you down, you haven't been paying attention. We've seen this government target law-abiding firearms owners by seizing firearms from normal, hardworking Canadians and at the same time reducing sentences for criminals who smuggle illegal firearms into Canada. We've seen them target energy workers who work day and night in our natural resource sectors that, by the way, allows the leader of the NDP to fill up his $80,000 BMW with gas every morning. And we've seen them target Western Canadians and Western Canada's entire energy sector by threatening to shut it down, calling our oil and natural gas dirty. And at the same time, importing oil from countries with horrible human rights records and next to no environmental standards. And the Prime Minister still can't figure out why there's so much division in our country. He's creating it, Madam Speaker. In February, when the Minister tabled this bill, he said cat videos and social media influencers would not be covered by it. However, this week, YouTube warned Canadians that this simply wasn't true. A CTV story reported that Jeanette Patel, head of government affairs at YouTube Canada, said that the draft law's wording gave the broadcast regulator scope to oversee everyday videos posted for other users to watch. She told the Natural Culture Summit in Ottawa that the bill's text appears to contradict the Heritage Minister's public assurances that it does not cover amateur content such as cat videos. I've heard back from many people across this country since last year about their concerns from when the bill was called C10. And since then, the calls and emails have just amplified about C11. I have a very hard time believing the use of this bill will only target big online streamers, especially when I've seen firsthand how far this government will go to end criticism. If you flash back a few months to the Prime Minister's trip to Europe, many politicians in the EU called out the member for Papineau's actions during the convoy. And I tweeted about this. And Jerry Butts, the former Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, tried to dismiss it right away. And he said, quote, "If you're getting your news from outlets..."
I want to remind the Honourable Minister that there will be a time for question and comments, and the heckling is not acceptable in the House. The Honourable Member for Saskatoon West has 2 minutes to continue.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Sometimes these things are hard to hear or understand, but what Gerald Butts said is that if you're getting your news from news outlets whose primary purpose is to divide you from your neighbours, the topic doesn't matter. It's long past time that we figured this out, end quote. Is this what we can expect under C11? Big government telling us what news is fact and what is misinformation when it doesn't match a certain narrative. It's obvious which voices the government wants to bring to Canadians online and which voices they'd like to tune out. The problem with this is Canada is a free and democratic nation. The foundation behind this trademark of ours is freedom of speech and expression. Listen, we've all got people who we may disagree with, but all voices deserve to be heard, regardless of whether or not they align with our political views. The moment we push forward with online censorship, divisions rise and Canadian democracy declines. Madam Speaker, we need to work on healing these wounds that have developed in our country. Leadership starts at the top. This begins with treating our fellow Canadians and members in this House with the dignity and respect that they deserve. Some have lost hope in reuniting our country, but I certainly haven't. Canada is known as one of the friendliest countries in the world. We look out for our allies, neighbours, and friends. Back home in Saskatchewan, we always look out for one another, no matter how bad our winters are. And I'm proud to be from a country and a province where we are there for each other. Over the past 2 years, we seem to have forgotten this trademark that makes us who we are. This bill, C11, works to divide us rather than bring us together. It will pit certain content providers against other ones. It will force Canadians to watch things they don't really want to see and make it difficult for them to watch things they do want to see. This is unacceptable. Censoring voices online is wrong and splits our nation even further. It's time to bring our country back together so we can get back to who we truly are, which is kind and friendly Canadians that are only known for heated arguments when the Stanley Cup playoffs are on. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources and to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
I listened with interest, and I'm wondering from an economic perspective if the member would agree that it's important for us to support our creative industry, which is an important economic sector in our country, and make sure that the intellectual property that they create stays here in our country, and that we sustain that industry going forward, rather than allowing it to be sold off and other countries only watching creators from other countries. Is it not important for us as a country to show support for our creative industries and to show the distinct voices, prairie voices like Heartland even, in a great TV show from Alberta? Isn't it important that we have that at the centre of our policies when we're looking at this?
The Honourable Member Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. It's a good one. Absolutely, we want to support culture in Canada. We want to support our content creators. And, you know, there's always a fear by certain members of this House to actually let our people free in the world. Our content creators, our talent in Canada is second to none. We have great producers, actors, everybody. We have a lot of talent, and we should not be ashamed of that, and we can work hard. And we don't need to give them special rules and special, control them in certain ways. They're big people. They know how to compete in the world stage. The world is their stage, and that's the beauty of the system that we have today with the wide open internet. And so we just need to let our Canadians shine. We need to help them where we can, but this is not the way to do it, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, and honourable friend from Saskatoon West. Thank you for the contribution into this discussion. I'm of the view that we really need to get this to committee. We have so many questions. We have issues we need refining. I'm wondering, to the extent that, for instance, the online streaming bill, doesn't take into account how some online streaming and online services promote disinformation and misinformation. We see it more now than we did last year when we were looking at C10. And I'm wondering if you would agree that it's time to get the bill to committee so that we can hear the witnesses and refine and improve the legislation.
The honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank the member for the question. You know, it's up to the House to put this to committee, but I would just say that last time this bill went to committee, there was a very important provision that was removed that caused a lot of stress, and it caused a lot of reactions in my office for sure. And so, you know, the committee will do its work when the time comes, and it will add or strengthen or do whatever that needs to be done to this bill. But at the end of the day, we have to be very, very careful that we are not limiting and constricting the ability of our content producers to actually compete in the internet world that we have today. Thank you.
Comments? The honourable member for Topic-Mactaquac.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And thanks to my honourable colleague for his remarks and thoughtful reflections on this bill. I'm just wondering from my honourable colleague if he would agree with me that this is a slippery slope that it seems like this government is moving on in this bill towards determining what is truth and what is not. Who gets to ultimately determine that? And as it relates to disinformation, I think Canadians are rightfully very concerned that this is an overreach by a government that just seems to continually be trampling on their individual rights and freedoms of speech and conscience and belief. And I think you've raised some very appropriate concerns. So appreciate any further comments you would have on that.
I don't think that I have raised any concerns, I would hope, and I would just ask the member to address his questions through the chair and not directly to the member. The honourable member for Saskatoon West has a minute and 20 seconds left to respond.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank to my honourable member for the question. It's a very, very good question. And this is kind of the heart, I think, of what we're talking about here today. Conceptually, it's easy to say, you know, this person can speak and this person can't. But in reality, it's very difficult to do that because who is the person that's going to decide that? We all know that there is content on the internet that is wrong, that is incorrect, and we know there's content that is true. It's sometimes hard to tell, and that's where we need to do some work. But when you start saying we can listen to this group, not listen to that group, this news organization is valid, this one isn't, that's a very, very slippery slope, as the member stated. And so we have to be very careful as we go down this road. We do need to be careful. We do need to have some controls over things, but the way that this is written, it gives way too much power to the CRTC to be the gatekeepers, to be able to say who is good and who is bad, and that's not a good place for us to go. So we need to be very concerned about that, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It's an honour to rise in this House once again on behalf of the great people of Cypress Hills Grasslands. And I'll begin my speech in this debate by considering the background of this bill. And there is a disturbing trend happening under this NDP Liberal coalition. They don't seem to respect our democratic process, and they don't seem to be interested in protecting it. So among many other examples, the most recent is passing Motion 11 to give themselves the power to prematurely shut down Parliament. They don't even pretend to use COVID as an excuse anymore. But they also don't like it when Conservatives mention that it is long overdue for them to remove restrictions on members, their staff, or the regular citizens from entering this place or from traveling within our own country, and insinuating that they are supposedly undesirable Canadians. Leaving those things aside, though, we are here today to debate yet another attempt by this government to extend its overly controlling approach to online content that people can access or publish. And that's the problem with Bill C11. The vast majority of it is a near-carbon copy of its predecessor, Bill C10, with the exception of some minor changes surrounding user-generated content. To debate this legislation properly, we need to fully understand how we got from C10 to C11. So let's refresh a few memories here. Originally, Bill C10 had a section which excluded user-generated content from its scope. And at Heritage Committee, it was suddenly removed. This threw the door open for the CRTC to regulate nearly anything on the internet. The government faced severe opposition to this, and rightly so. At first, it might appear that they learned something from all of the embarrassment. But sadly, if you dig a little deeper, it's clear that they haven't. What's even more sad is the NDP have sold out and are going along with it, and here we go. Section 4.1 is back in Bill C11, but it's now accompanied by Section 4.12, which allows for an exemption on the previous exception. This again creates a loophole for the CRTC to regulate any content that either directly or indirectly generates revenue. In other words, the CRTC can regulate nearly anything on the internet. At the heart of this bill is a lurking threat of expanding censorship. It is only a matter of time as this new opening moves through the process of bureaucracy. We must carefully consider more than the bill in front of us as it exists on paper. Otherwise, we'll move too close to Big Brother for comfort, where it will run or where it'll turn out to be as toxic as a reality show, but without any of the entertainment value. And I hope that bad jokes will remain safe from censorship as well. Liberal members, along with their enablers in the NDP, may say that this is not their intention behind the bill. If it isn't, I'll remind them that good intentions can still pave the road to a very bad place, and that's what Conservatives have been keeping on saying and trying to remind them of. We're doing our job as the official opposition because it's our duty to point out any harmful risks in legislation so that Parliament can make better decisions on behalf of Canadians. Really, though, this is what every MP should keep in mind. And when I took my oath in office as an MP, I swore to defend the Constitution and the fundamental rights of every Canadian. Every single MP did the same thing. We are all under that same obligation. It's entirely possible to fix the problems with this bill while achieving what the NDP Liberals say it's supposed to do. There should absolutely be a level playing field between smaller Canadian broadcasters and larger streaming services. Canadian content creators have something unique to bring to the table, and we all want to see them in the spotlight. No issues there. We're happy to pass this part of the legislation that supports Canadian producers. But where it goes too far is unnecessarily allowing for government to control what people can or can't access online. And ironically, what type of content Canadians should or shouldn't produce. It's extremely irresponsible to ignore the warnings we have received. Before we know it, it could completely get out of hand. If the NDP Liberals want to deny it, they should explain to Canadians how they are leaving room for it to happen without closing the obvious loophole. It's a failure of due diligence, and there's no excuse for it. Madam Speaker, Canada stands in a long tradition of free expression. We are admired and envied around the world for our heritage of free speech, among many other freedoms. For centuries, and over the years in our own lifetime, we have seen it practiced in newspapers, letters to the editor, and people just simply writing letters to their elected officials. Today, we all express ourselves on the internet as a free space. We can post our opinions, we can access information, engage with other people around the whole entire world. We have done it as citizens, and we do it as members of Parliament, communicating with our fellow Canadians. Right now, it's easy to make posts and videos with our thoughts on all kinds of issues, and it all could be subject to regulation. Bill C11 fails to provide safeguards for our freedom as we know it. Government can eventually control what everyday citizens post online. This is what Peter Menzies, the former CRTC Vice Chair, had to say about Bill C10 from the last Parliament. He said, quote, "It doesn't just infringe on free expression, it constitutes a full-blown assault upon it, and through it, the foundations of democracy," unquote. So that should catch all of our attention. The former CRTC Vice Chair warned that this legislation is toying with the fundamental right. He's in a position to understand better than some how necessary freedom of speech is for a democratic process to remain intact. Citizens must always be able to disagree with their governments openly and strongly, period. We are eroding this right so that the government, through the CRTC, could have the ability to regulate what it does or does not like to hear. Quite frankly, they don't like to hear the dissent from the opposition. That said, Bill C11 is not only going to give us a paternalistic government, it might create practical problems in the area that it claims to be helping. Currently, anyone can pull out their device and head over to YouTube where they can access any content that they would like. Whether it's kitchen renos, how to fix your car problems, or viewing content posted by friends and family, or connecting with other people around the world. It works well enough for now. But with the government involved, the CRTC might decide to dictate what content you should see when you search for something specific. While government-mandated algorithms analyze how Canadian the content is, what you're looking for might get pushed to the back of the queue of your search results if it simply doesn't pass the test. You're trying to renovate your back deck, and the helpful video from a YouTuber you saw a little while ago isn't so easy to find anymore because maybe the best creator didn't happen to be Canadian, Madam Speaker. Instead, You're flooded with video.
Order. I see that there are people, there are some parliamentarians that are either eager to ask questions or are trying to have conversations across the way. I would just say, if you want to have a conversation, please take it out. If you're waiting to ask questions and comments, or if you're wanting to do that, it's not quite time yet. There's still 3 minutes left, and then the honourable members will be able to ask questions and comments. The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grassland.
Well, you see, they're trying to censor me already, Madam Speaker. It's already begun.
That's right. That's right.
So instead, you're flooded with videos about beavers and maple syrup. While you really need to be is on page 27 of the search results to find the video of the guy to help give you the advice you need to build your deck, who maybe isn't Canadian. All because this government thinks that it knows better. Again, we do need to support the creators and the content that is made in Canada. Nobody has any issue with that. We don't need a Band-Aid solution to do it. What's most needed from the government is taking advantage of every opportunity to build and support our entertainment industry to be competitive and successful in the marketplace. We need more and more talented Canadians that can make it here. And that's what happens when our entertainment industry has a good foundation from a strong economy. But good luck with that underneath this Liberal government. With Bill C11, we're talking about government overreach, censorship, higher entertainment costs, and half-baked solutions. Most concerning of all, we see the NDP Liberals giving the CRTC power to regulate not only what Canadians can see online, but also what they can say. They could also try to decide what it means to be Canadian in our video searches or elsewhere. Madam Speaker, Bill C11 is dangerous, it's ridiculous, and it just doesn't make any sense. On behalf of my fellow Canadians, we will continue to stand up and we will continue to defend your rights alongside my fellow Conservatives here. It's the right thing to do, and we can only hope that the NDP and the Liberals in the backbench will stand with us and make sure that this bill gets due process and accomplishes what it should actually be trying to accomplish. Thank you. I have a sub-amendment. I would like to move, seconded by the member from Souris Moose Mountain, that the amendment be amended by adding the following: and that the committee report back no later than 10 sitting days following the adoption of this motion. 10 sitting.
Our Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
My understanding, Madam Speaker, is that when a member sits, they're ceding the floor.
Had some time left, so he caught himself on time. Mr. Patzer, seconded by Mr. Kitchen, moves the following sub-amendment, that the amendment be amended by adding the following, and that the committee report back no later than 10 sitting days following the adoption of this motion. The sub-amendment is in order. Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Well, Madam Speaker, I can assure this member and all Conservatives that nobody is more interested in preserving the content that they create in this House than me. Hear, hear. The content that they give me to put out on social media. If I thought for 1 second that user-generated content would be impacted by this bill, I certainly would not be in favor of it. But I would like to point out to the member that there are several sections in this piece of legislation that explicitly preserve user-generated content. Sections 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, Section 3A, Section 4.1, Section 4.2, and Section 4.3, subsection 3. I'm curious, simple question, has the member read the bill, and has he read those sections in particular?
Good. The Honourable Member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And if the member actually listened to my speech, I referenced Section 4.1, Section 2, because it's part of it is the same as the previous bill, and it added on to it, which didn't actually help the issue. And that was one of the primary issues that we had in the last Parliament with the bill, was that Section 4.1. I alluded into my speech that there are sections of the bill that we would look to support, because there are good things in this bill. But again, the member opposite, he wants to be the czar of the future Ministry of Truth, so it's unsurprising that he would ask a question without actually paying attention.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Shefford. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I was listening to my colleague's speech, and I'd like to thank him for that. But he talked about the importance of fighting against misinformation or disinformation. And one way of doing that is with local media. Local media report on the facts of what's actually going on in our communities. There seems to be a problem with the interpretation, so we'll try again. Is it working now? Is it working now? Okay, the honourable member can start her question over again. The honourable member for Shefford. Thank you, Madam Speaker. So I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. He talked about the importance of the issue of disinformation. And one of the ways of combating disinformation is with our local media. And our local media, they report on the facts on the ground in our communities. So in Quebec, our local independent media are asking for protections, and we need to make sure we provide those protections, but in a way that evolves, because technology evolves quickly. And our local community independent media, they depend on us. I'm very proud of them. There's a co-op radio station. All those stations are asking us for protection. So they were calling for this since 1991. So it's starting. They've been waiting for a long time. So what can my colleagues say about fighting against disinformation? The honourable member.
I mean, disinformation is going to be one of the biggest issues, presently, but going forward. We've all been bombarded with it a lot over the last number of years. But she also touched on another very important piece, and that was the small papers, our local community papers, the local groups that actually do real journalism. And I think that that's where we need to get back to. And the problem that I see with a lot of government legislation going forward is the supports don't actually line up with supporting the small town papers, the small community papers. And as we go forward, we're going to start to see more and more of those little papers be wiped off of the planet here. And it's going to be the big digital platforms from, like the CBC and others that are going to be the ones who are going to be dominating the space and getting rid of all these other little pieces. And maybe even a company like TikTok. You're absolutely right. So I think, though, we got to find ways to better support those small papers and do better for them going forward.
Questions and comments? We have time for a brief question. The honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
It's been very entertaining this afternoon. The Conservatives are saying that Canada is going to be turned into North Korea. Now my friend's saying the Liberals are going to stop you from watching deck renovation videos. But I did agree with him about the need, he said, to fight for the fundamental rights of every Canadian and how government's controlling what people can do. So I was noticing the cover of the Journal de Montréal today, and they had a picture of 39 Conservatives who are against the rights of women to make choices. And his picture's in there, so I'd like to ask him if that's disinformation or his picture.
Point of order, the honourable member for Edmonton Riverbend.
Yeah, Madam Speaker, this obviously has nothing to do with the debate. From someone who is absolutely pro-choice, who has 2 daughters and would fight always for their ability to have the right to choose, is that
of debate? It's more a point of debate. So I'm going to allow the honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Madam Speaker.
Well, I did ask for a small question. The honourable member has been providing a lot of feedback. 2 seconds for the question so that we can get to the answer, because there's only 37 seconds left.
Simple question. His picture's on the front page of the Journal de Montréal with 38 other Conservatives who are against abortion. Is it a real picture, or did they make a mistake, and is that disinformation?
Member Cypress Hills Grasslands.
My picture there, Charlie.
Well, it's pretty fascinating to hear that it's the NDP, it's been the Liberals, it's been the Bloc, have been the ones who have been talking about that issue, right? We're here focused on the bill that's before us here today. We're not focused on that. We're focused on this. And at this point in time, we need people to stay focused on the debate at hand, and instead of trying to use these distraction techniques and playing cheap political games, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Beauport-Limoilou. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to speak today to Bill C11. Madam Speaker, the last time there were amendments to the Broadcasting Act, I had just met the man who would eventually become my husband, the father of my 4 children. I met him in 1991. I was 14 years old, which is saying something. Like my colleague from Calgary Nose Hill, I knew and I grew up with Fraggle Rock, which I loved, by the way. I also grew up with Passepartout and Pop Citrouille as well, children's programs that are outstanding in terms of their quality and diversity of content. It is precisely so that young people can have access to content of this quality on the platforms they use that I am pleased to see C11 move forwards with legislation. C11 will allow artisans to have the funds necessary to showcase their creativity both at home and abroad. A little over an hour ago, I mentioned an experience I had with a content distributor who, despite the fact that I indicated that French was my preference, only offered me American, British, and Korean works. In some cases, it was impossible for me to get a French translation, even if it was only by subtitles. In order to find works from Quebec, from France, or Francophone Africa, I had to search and search and search for a long time. C11's openness to the discoverability of works is a strong step forward in making it easier for Quebecers and Canadians to access content from their own communities, their own artists, and their own craftspeople. My colleagues have talked about the importance of letting large foreign companies do their job and meet user demand. In some aspects of the economy, I would tend to agree with them. However, when it comes to culture, I simply cannot agree. We should not let outsiders manage our own culture. In the case of Quebec and Canada's French-speaking communities, it is totally illogical to allow foreign companies that are not French-speaking culture, of French-speaking culture, tell French-speaking people that they know their own culture better than they do. This is a modern form of colonialism and a modern form of imperialism. Nothing more, nothing less. It is making a whole population believe that their culture is simply not important, that it has less value than any other culture. My colleagues also compare the current situation with the internet to that of 25 to 30 years ago when the internet was not as accessible as it is now. My colleague from Edmonton Riverbend was right to say that people used to listen to the radio or to television to access Canadian productions, but now people turn to the internet. It's true. I would like to remind you that thanks to radio, people discovered music of all genres, in French, in English, and in my case, in Innu. And that this access meant that we had access to a variety of art forms. It allowed users to discover new artists. The quotas at the time allowed for the discovery of Quebec and Canadian artists, which is an excellent thing. Of course, not everything was perfect. I remember when I was working at the radio, at one point we had a Bryan Adams album that didn't meet all the criteria for Canadian content quotas because part of the quota wasn't filled. This Bryan Adams CD was produced abroad, so it wasn't 100% Canadian, so it didn't fit into the quota. Are there improvements to make to this? Of course. But that said, this does not mean that just because there's improvements to be made, we should put both feet on the brakes instead of moving forward. Quite the contrary. Proposals have been made and have been accepted. I imagine that there will be other proposals to make over time, but they have to be done. Unfortunately, I heard very few proposals coming from the official opposition. I heard a lot of official opposition from the official opposition, but few proposals. It is normal for Francophones to have easier access to... Is it normal that French speakers have easier access to Korean works than to works in their own mother tongue? No, okay. Don't get me wrong. Out of curiosity, I had a look at some of the Korean proposals that were made to me. And I enjoyed the scripts, I enjoyed the scenarios, I enjoyed the costumes, and I enjoyed the sets. My curiosity allowed me to discover another culture. So why Shouldn't this go both ways? Allow our people also to discover Francophone Quebec artists and Anglophone Canadian artists so they can be seen the world over. C11 could allow this to happen. Having high-quality content in our language is important. Non-Francophones could do what I did with Korean pieces. They could discover what we do here, discover artists from Quebec, and take an interest in Quebec arts and culture. However, today, we need to cultivate our curiosity and interest, but to do so, we need to facilitate accessibility and discoverability of quality content. That is what C11 seeks to do. Some may say to me, well, those who want to have access to Francophone culture will just have to do what you do. Just do what you do, Julie. Just search for it. But such a way of thinking is rather alarming. Why should I have to look for elements of my culture when others only are one search away from access to their own culture? These people, I unfortunately have to interrupt the honourable member, who will have 3 minutes once we go back to the study of this bill, as it is 5:30 p.m. We will now move on to private members'